Imagine you hold power in the empire. Maps, walls, police, textbooks, everything speaks one, your version. And suddenly, in the center of Berlin, stands a gate that has been closed to everyone for 28 years, both east and west. This is not a monument, it is evidence. If it is just a decoration, it is not kept in isolation between two worlds. One order from you, and people will be explained. Regime, security, symbol of the era, and the question will die. What will you choose? To acknowledge that the gate was not guarded against people, but for the people? Or to make everyone think that it was meant to be that way? And now, let's look at why the Brandenburg Gate has been turned into a forbidden zone, and what does not add up in it. Enter the center of Berlin. Stand before the Brandenburg Gate. Look at these massive columns, at the ancient chariot on top, at the reliefs depicting battles of gods and titans. These are the only gates of the capital of Germany that have survived to this day. The only ones out of 18. 300 years ago, Berlin was a completely different place. Not an open city with wide avenues. A true star fortress, surrounded by walls dotted with bastions. 18 gates. 18 points of entry and exit. Think about this number. Why exactly that many? Why not 4 for the cardinal directions? Why not 8? 18 is an excess for an ordinary fortress. For comparison, look at Moscow in those years. The Kremlin itself represented a star-shaped fortress. Around it was the White City. Even further away was the Earth City, which had more than 30 gates. More than 30. Only the names of the squares have remained from them. Znamensky, Varvarka, Nikolsky, Voskresensky, Ilyinsky, Krasnya, Tverskoy, Sretenka, Arbat, Nikitsky. You can compare the size of Berlin with its 18 gates and Moscow with its 30. Moscow was larger. Berlin is more compact. But both cities followed one principle: multiple access points, a complex system of entrances and exits. This is what stands out. In Moscow, as well as in other Russian cities, gates look exactly like gates. Massive stone arches, sturdy walls through which carts enter and people pass. Functional, clear, logical. Gates fulfill their purpose. They let through or do not let through. The Brandenburg Gate of Berlin resembles a Greek colonnade, an entrance to an ancient temple, a triumphal structure created more for contemplation than for defense. Elegant columns, graceful proportions. This is not something that should stop an army. This is not something through which one can pass and feel protected by the city's walls. Today, the Brandenburg Gate is a symbol of united Germany, a tourist attraction, a place for meetings and photographs. Of the 18 gates of ancient Berlin, only this one remains. The other 17 have vanished, erased, demolished, forgotten. And here is what is curious. Not so long ago, just a few decades ago, these gates were in a rather strange position. From 1961 to 1989, they stood right by the Berlin Wall, formally in the territory of East Berlin. It seemed that East Germans could approach their historical monument. But no. The authorities of East Germany fenced off the gates with yet another wall. Small, but enough. It turned into a strange enclave. The gates were located between two Berlins, but belonged to neither. Neither the residents of the East nor the residents of the West had access to them. Stop for a second. Reflect on this. Gates that lead nowhere. gates that no one can approach. Gates turned into a museum exhibit, cut off from people. Why? What is the point of guarding a decoration? If this is just a historical monument, why has it been isolated from both sides? If it is a symbol of the city, why are the townspeople forbidden from approaching it? Or maybe the reason is that the gates represented something more than just a beautiful arch. Something that the authorities of both Berlins did not want people to access. Look at the photograph from July 1945. Ruins. Charred, blackened columns from fires. A destroyed quadriga. Damaged reliefs. Berlin lay in ruins, and the gates shared its fate. But they endured. The structure withstood bombings, artillery shelling, fires. The official version claims that the Brandenburg Gate was built in 1791. Just 2 years. 2 years to create such a monumental structure. According to the project of architect Karl Gotthard Langhans, and this was his first architectural experience. Imagine, a person has never designed anything like this before, and suddenly they create one of the main buildings of the capital in 2 years. The first attempt a failure? Or perhaps it was not a construction from scratch, but a restoration of what was already there. We are told that the Brandenburg Gate was inspired by the propylaea of the Athenian Acropolis in ancient Greece. There are even special diagrams showing the similarity between the two structures. 6 columns here, 6 columns there. Classic proportions. Antique harmony. Only the similarity ends with these 6 columns. Unless, of course, it is assumed that the staircase of the Athenian propylaea is hidden underground. And this is quite possible. The so-called ancient Greece was excavated just like ancient Rome was excavated. Excavations, clearing cultural layers, extracting fragments of buildings from multi-meter deposits of soil. But if the Brandenburg Gate imitates ancient Greek architecture, an interesting question arises. What then did the architect Stasov imitate when he built almost identical gates in St. Petersburg? The Moscow triumphal gates in the northern capital were erected in 1838. Pay attention to an important detail. They were not built in honor of the victory over Napoleon, not in memory of the War of 1812, as triumphant structures were usually erected in Russia. These gates are dedicated to a completely different event, the victorious conclusion of the Russo-Turkish War of 1828. Why this particular war? Why not a more significant, more large-scale victory over the French? The question remains unanswered. If not counting the quadriga at the top, the Moscow gates of St. Petersburg and the Brandenburg Gate of Berlin look like twins. The Petersburg Gate has 2 pairs of 6 columns each. The Berlin Gate has the same 2 pairs of 6 columns, only connected by a wall. It seems as if they were built from the same blueprint, making minimal changes. It feels like there was a unified project, a standard scheme that was adapted to specific conditions. Berlin received a wall between the columns. Petersburg did without it. But the base is the same. I specifically searched for similar structures all over the world. I tried to find at least a few more examples of such gates, with 2 rows of 6 columns, with those characteristic proportions. I found nothing. In the overwhelming majority of cases, gates are made as arches. The Triumphal Arch in Moscow, the Arch at the Carousel Square in Paris, the Arch of Constantine in Rome, Arches, arches, arches. This is the standard. This is a clear, familiar construction. Passage inside a massive stone structure. The gates with a colonnade are found only in two places, Berlin and St. Petersburg. Nowhere else. Why? The Red Gates of Moscow stood until 1927. Then they were demolished. Moreover, they were demolished deliberately, methodically. They were not carefully disassembled for restoration. They were destroyed. The Bolsheviks were known for their fight against religion, against temples. But few know that triumphal arches also fell under the roller. Why? What threat did the ancient gates pose to the new authorities? What ideological danger did the triumphal arch, dedicated to the victory in the war, carry? The Red Gates were supposedly erected in 1709 by the decree of Peter the Great, in honor of the victory at the Battle of Poltava. The question that no one asks is, why in Moscow? Why not in St. Petersburg, the new capital that Peter was building and loved? Why was the triumphal structure placed in the old capital, to which the reformer Tsar had a cool attitude, to put it mildly? And the Tver gates, which once adorned the Passion Square, now Pushkin Square, disappeared even earlier. In 1720, they were demolished. Or perhaps they never existed at all in the form described by chronicles and documents. A strange picture emerges. The Brandenburg Gate in Berlin and the Moscow gates in St. Petersburg are a unique architectural type without analogues. Two structures in the whole world, and both appeared in the late 18th, early 19th century, approximately at the same time, according to a similar design, for some special purposes. Now pay attention to what crowns both types of gates. On the Brandenburg gates, on the Moscow and St. Petersburg gates, on the Triumphal Arch in Moscow, everywhere there is a quadriga, an ancient two-wheeled chariot drawn by 4 horses. The same symbol adorns the Bolshoi Theater. The same chariot is found on many buildings around the world. Indeed, at the Moscow Triumphal Arch, there are not 4 horses, but 6. But this is already a reference not to ancient Greece, but to ancient Rome. The 6 horses is a Roman tradition. Wait, the Brandenburg Gate allegedly imitates the ancient Greek propylaea. 6 columns, classic proportions, Hellenic aesthetics. And the quadriga on top is purely a Roman symbol. A two-wheeled chariot with 4 horses belongs to the culture of ancient Rome, not Athens. It results in a kind of architectural mix. Greece at the base, Rome at the top, and all this on German soil in the center of Berlin. If we go into details, the picture becomes even more confusing. The reliefs on the gates depict people fighting with centaurs. We are explained, this is an allegory of the struggle between civilization and barbarism. People are bearers of culture, reason, order. Centaurs are the embodiment of savagery, primal strength, chaos. But open any book on ancient Greek mythology. The centaur Chiron was the greatest teacher. He raised heroes. He taught Jason, Achilles, Orpheus. He was a mentor and friend to Heracles. A sage, healer, expert in stars and herbs. Where is the barbarism in this image? Where is the animal rage? Centaurs in Greek myths are carriers of ancient knowledge, beings that combine nature and reason, teachers, not savages. So who is really depicted on the reliefs of the Brandenburg Gate? Whom are these sword-wielding people defeating? Bearers of wisdom or truly barbarians? In the passages of the gates, other scenes are placed. Hercules fights the giant. Hercules kills the Hydra. Battles, clashes, confrontations. Hero against monsters. Man against titans. Everywhere war, everywhere blood, everywhere death. At the base of the gates stand statues. Mars is the Roman god of war. Minerva is the goddess of wisdom, but she is also the goddess of war, strategy, and battle. No matter where you look, there is one motif everywhere: confrontation, battle, conflict. And here is a paradox that cannot be ignored. These gates were originally called the Gates of Peace. Peace. But every square centimeter of their surface is covered with scenes of war. Battles of gods and titans. Hercules kills his enemies. Centaurs perish from human swords. Mars and Minerva, deities of war, stand as guardians. What kind of world is this? Or is the name a mockery, a sign of the victors left on the monument to the defeated? There is a plan of the Brandenburg Gate from the year 1820. According to the official version, the gate itself was built 30 years before this plan, in 1791. In the drawing, we see columns that resemble modern ones, the very ones that can be called walls. But there are also paintings from the 18th century where these gates are depicted on thin columns, quite different ones, as if the artist was painting a different structure, or the gates underwent significant changes in a short period. Although officially no reconstructions were carried out, but there are gates of a completely different type, the Golden Gates of Vladimir. They seem to be from another world, from another reality. No Roman symbolism with quadrigas and gods of war. No ancient Greek architecture with columns and proportions. This white stone structure is from the year 1264, the so-called pre-Mongol construction, the time when Rus had not yet known the Tatar yoke, the time of great princes and white stone architecture. Note the fundamental difference. These gates are designed like a church. Above the gates, right within the thickness of the wall, there is a full-fledged temple. And it was not added later, centuries afterwards. The church was originally designed during the construction of the gates themselves. It is integrated into the defensive structure as an inseparable part of it. This is a unique solution. Temple gates. A defensive structure that simultaneously serves as a place of worship. Imagine this. You enter the city through a holy place. Every passage through the gates is a passing through a consecrated space. There is an ancient legend passed down from generation to generation. When soldiers passed through these gates, setting out on a military campaign or into battle, their sins were absolved. The priest would bless the warriors right at the entrance. Passing through the gates was equated with the forgiveness of sins. The church indulgence built directly into the fortress wall. Only this version raises many questions. How can one forgive sins in advance that have not yet been committed? To release ahead of time what a person may or may not do in the future? Does this not contradict the very essence of repentance and forgiveness? After all, forgiveness is given for what has already been committed, consciously, repentantly. Or did this ritual have a completely different meaning? Perhaps passing through the gate temple truly changed something in a person, cleansed not from future sins, but from something else, prepared for what awaited beyond the city. Even more doubts arise about the origin of the church above the gates. Was the current temple originally a religious structure? Or was its purpose different and then repurposed for the Orthodox canon? But the fact remains indisputable. These were indeed the gates, the main ceremonial entrance to Vladimir. Princes entered through them. Armies passed through them. It was the most important access point to one of the largest cities of ancient Rus. At the beginning of the 19th century, round towers were added to the corners of the pylons. The official version, the structure of the gate supports was weakened, so it was decided to add buttresses. Weakened by what? By time? Or weakened by the fact that something was taken out from within? At the same time, the arches of the gate were rebuilt from old stone, and on them, a new brick church was already erected, consecrated in 1810. That is, what we see now is a reconstruction, a new building based on old ruins. There is an interesting photograph of these gates from 1899. On the round towers, which contained buttresses, there are symbols that we now know as the Star of David. It is interesting what this symbol meant for the Orthodox Church in the 19th century. But there is another type of gate, the so-called double gates. A great example is the Voskresensky Gate, or the Iversky Gate. These are double passage gates of the Kitai-Gorod Wall, through which people passed from Manyezhnaya Square to Red Square. Indeed, these gates are not original. The original ones were demolished in 1931. They were restored in 1995. Only 60 years have passed, during which two opposing decisions were made. First, to demolish, then to restore something similar. This is what the Iberian Gate looked like before its demolition. And this is a photograph from the end of the 19th century. Emperor Nicholas III and his entourage pass through these gates to Red Square on the day of his coronation in 1896. Pay attention to the arches. It feels like they are half buried in the ground. This is a watercolor from the early 19th century. There is no exact date, just the beginning of the 19th century. There is also no author. Here, the arches look completely different. They are about twice as high. I wonder if this is before or after the fire of 1812. Note, there is some wild vegetation growing on the Kremlin wall, and even on the towers of the Kremlin. Perhaps small trees, as if this were the abandoned factory of Sava Morozov. Of course, one could take this as artistic license, but there are also other drawings. This is Fyodor Alexeyev, 1812. Red Square in Moscow. On the Kremlin wall and above the gates of the Spasskaya Tower, there are just some hanging gardens of Semiramis. Here is another painting by Alexeyev. In it, we see the very Iverskaya Gate. Let's compare it with a watercolor by an unknown artist from the early 19th century. In both images, the arches are quite high. That is, at the beginning of the 19th century, they were not filled in. But by the end of the century, they were half buried. But what else is striking? Look at the number of floors of these towers. In the painting by an unknown artist, there are 3 floors above the gates, and then 2 towers grow above that. Alexeyev has 2 floors, or maybe only 2 at most. And in the photographs, there are a maximum of 2 floors, or maybe just 1. Then the question arises, how did artists actually paint? From memory? Or were they simply told, draw it like this? And did they not see these towers in real life? Or did they redraw from someone else's drawings? This speaks of the forgery of our entire history. After all, Alexeyev's towers do not resemble those in the photograph. Alexeyev's towers are significantly taller and rounded. In the photo, there is a clear edge. According to official history, these towers were not rebuilt. The gates were bricked up in 1535, and the tent towers were added in 1680, almost 150 years later. Two similar towers were discovered in Berlin. This is St. Nicholas Church, or Nikolaikirche, the oldest church in Berlin. Its founding date is the 13th century. This appearance with two Gothic towers was acquired by St. Nicholas Church only at the end of the 19th century. To be precise, in 1878. Before that, there was only one tower. This can be seen in the engraving of Berlin. The letter I designates San Nikolaus in Berlin. Next to the letter A, we only see a solitary spire. But the building with two towers is still present in Berlin. Here it is, marked with the letter Ash. In the footnote, it is noted as Der Turm. It is interesting that Gothic architecture often features buildings with two towers. Take, for example, Cologne Cathedral. But what were these Gothic towers doing on the Iberian Gate of the Kitaï-Gorod Wall? We have the entire Kremlin with its towers, pure Gothic. And only inside the walls are supposedly Christian shrines. This is how Nikolai Church looked in 1827, a completely asymmetrical, one-sided church. One could even ask, is this even a church? But this tower was completed later. Initially, the church looked like this. This is a reconstruction, or rather, a model of the reconstruction. What is this church made of? Note, the lower part of the tower's foundation is made of granite cobblestones. I am sometimes troubled by the question, where did these cobblestones come from in such quantities to pave the streets? Or maybe from such old, destroyed buildings? Only the lower part is made of cobblestone. Everything else is made of red brick. Look at the size of this church. It is simply gigantic. Can it be compared to our pre-Mongol structures? To the tiny St. George's Cathedral in Yuriev-Polsky? To the small Dmitrievsky Cathedral? But I believe that this building has no relation to the oldest church in Berlin. It is just as much a new construction of the 19th century as the Cologne Cathedral, which is also considered to have been founded in the 13th century, but all the main works that gave it its current appearance were done in the 19th century. Furthermore, Nikolaikirche was almost completely destroyed during World War II. These were ruins. They were restored only in 1983. As we are told from the old drawings and plans, miraculously preserved. Everything around was burning and destroyed, but the paper drawings remained. This also applies to our churches, which are burning and being destroyed, but the relics of the saints in honor of whom these churches were founded remain unharmed. The Dmitrievsky Cathedral in Vladimir has burned almost once every 100 years. It was destroyed and rebuilt. But the piece of fabric of St. Demetrius of Thessalonica, in honor of whom this cathedral was established, is still there. Miracles. Just miracles all around. The photograph of the Golden Gate from 1899 shows yet another oddity. A Star of David is depicted on the round turret buttresses, a six-pointed star, on an Orthodox church in the 19th century. This symbol is now associated with Judaism, but what was it doing on a Christian temple? What significance did it have for the church of that era? Or were the towers completed by non-Orthodox craftsmen? Or did the symbol have a completely different, forgotten meaning? In some old churches throughout Russia, similar signs can be found. Six-pointed stars, interwoven triangles. They were not considered foreign. They were not perceived as something contradictory to Christianity. They were part of the architectural language of that time. But over time, this language was forgotten. The symbols were reinterpreted. Many were covered with plaster during later restorations. They were erased as irrelevant. And today, only rare photographs preserve the memory of what was. Double Gothic towers of the Iberian Gate. The entire Moscow Kremlin is Gothic. Inside the walls are Christian sanctuaries: Cologne Cathedral, Nikolai Kirche, the towers of the Kremlin, one architectural system. The Brandenburg Gate is a Greco-Roman mix. The Moscow Gate of St. Petersburg is almost identical to the Brandenburg Gate. The Golden Gate of Vladimir is a white stone church. At least 3 different architectural codes on the territory of Europe and Russia, but all built within a narrow time frame according to the official version. The end of the 18th, the beginning of the 19th century. 3 different civilizations, or one with 3 functional types of structures? The answer lies in what has disappeared. Berlin, the fortress with 18 gates, has disappeared. Only one remains: the Greek Gate, which does not function as a gate. Moscow lost 30 gates. Artists painted buildings of different sizes. The height of the arches changes before our eyes. The number of stories of the towers does not match. Everything is being restored according to the miraculously preserved drawings. The relics of saints are indestructible. Where are the other 17 gates of Berlin? Where are the other 29 gates of Moscow? They were not dismantled. They were erased, demolished in 1720, in 1927, in 1931. The destruction of gates coincides with pivotal moments in history. After 1720, the large-scale reforms of Peter, the complete restructuring of the state, Europeanization, a break with the old way of life. After 1927, the establishment of the Soviet state, the remodeling of cities under a new ideology, the erasure of former symbols. The gates were not just defensive structures. They represented nodes of a certain system. When this system stopped working or was deliberately turned off, the unnecessary nodes were methodically dismantled. They were removed, erased, destroyed. Only exemplary samples were left. The Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, the Golden Gate in Vladimir, like museum exhibits, as a reminder of something that existed and came to an end. What kind of system required 18 entry and exit points in one city? Think about this question. Look at the plan of any medieval fortress. 4 main gates to the north, south, east, and west. Sometimes intermediate ones are added: northeast, southwest. A maximum of 8. This is logical, clear, and strategically justified. 18 gates is not a defense. It is something fundamentally different. Moreover, look at the very plan of Berlin Fortress. The star-shaped form with rays radiating from the center. The same principle can be seen in the plan of Moscow. The same geometry is repeated in dozens of European cities. We are told, this is a bastion system of fortifications, an invention of the gunpowder era. Protrusions allow for flanking fire along the walls. But look at these plans from above. This is not just fortification. This is intricate geometry, exact angles, mathematically calculated proportions. Symmetry that does not provide military advantages, but creates a certain pattern, a certain shape, a form that could serve entirely different purposes. Not for protection from cannons, but for something related to energy, to fields, to forces that we do not know about today. Berlin was not just a fortress. Berlin was a terminal, a junction station, a place where paths converged from different points. The gates did not lead to the city. They led somewhere else, perhaps to other cities, through a system we do not understand, perhaps between different points in space, between times, between worlds or realities. 18 directions, 18 paths, 18 connections with other terminals of the same network. Moscow, with its 30 gates, was an even larger hub, a more important point in this system. When the system was shut down, for some reason, as a result of a catastrophe or intentionally, the gates turned into meaningless decorations. Beautiful, monumental, but having lost their function. They began to be demolished so that people would forget, so that no one would ask uncomfortable questions, so that no one would try to understand what these structures were actually for. The only ones preserved, as a monument, as a symbol of victory over the old system, over those who built it and used it. Let us return to the symbolism of the Brandenburg Gate. Each relief is a fragment of a single narrative. The centaur teachers, who in myths were called sages, are presented here as enemies of humanity. Hercules fights against the giants, beings who are described in ancient texts as the first inhabitants of the earth, preceding the gods. Titans against Olympians, ancients against the new ones, those who were first against those who came after and took their place. This is not just decorative scenes from mythology. This is a coded history, a tale of the change of civilizations, about how some were overthrown, while others took their places and rewrote the past to suit themselves. Mars and Minerva stand at the bases like guardians. The gods of war guard the passage. The quadriga above symbolizes triumph, the chariot of the victors entering the captured city. And the name, the gates of the world, is a mockery, a bitter irony of the victors. The world has come, but at what cost? At the cost of the destruction of those who possessed knowledge, those who were depicted as centaurs and giants, bearers of wisdom turned into monsters and barbarians in legends. Now look at Nikolai Church. Both towers have clocks that show the identical time, not Moscow time and Berlin time, not different time zones, absolute synchronization. For the church, this is pointless. One clock is enough to show the service time. Why duplicate? But when considering the building as a technical object, everything gains logic. A double system for reliability. Synchronization between different points of the network. Accuracy, critically important for the operation of the mechanism. Clocks appeared in 1878. At that time, the Iberian Gate received a clock mechanism. The Spasskaya Tower of the Kremlin was equipped with chimes. Throughout Europe, tower clocks were widely installed on old structures. Unified time, uniform pace, a synchronized network of objects scattered across the continent. But for what purpose? Churches do not need such precise time coordination between cities. However, a transportation system or a network of portals could very well require it. All Gothic architecture with its spires, towers, complex geometry. The Iberian gates with Gothic towers on the Russian fortress wall. The Kremlin, entirely built in the Gothic style, inside which stand Orthodox churches. Cologne Cathedral and Nikolai Kirche in Germany. These are not different architectural traditions. This is a unified system, spread throughout Europe. From Berlin to Moscow, from Paris to Vladimir. 3 architectural codes. Greco-Roman gates with colonnades, Gothic tower structures, white stone church gates. 3 types for 3 different functions within one system, and all of them appeared or were reconstructed in a narrow time frame. The end of the 18th, the beginning of the 19th century. About 50 years. During this short period, hundreds of monumental structures suddenly emerged or were restored throughout Europe and Russia. A building boom of this scale requires huge resources, millions of tons of stone, thousands of skilled craftsmen, decades of continuous work for each project. Where did all this come from in an era when Europe was torn apart by wars? When Napoleon marched through the continent in flames? When cities burned and were destroyed? They did not build. They dug up. They restored. They adapted to new needs what they found, what remained from the previous ones, from those who were before. Artists painted buildings they had not seen, or they painted from memory what they had seen in childhood, and it had already changed. The height of arches varies from painting to painting. The number of stories of towers does not match. Some artists depict 3 stories, others 2, and in photographs, 1. Officially, the structures were not rebuilt, but the images contradict each other. Either the artists were fantasizing or the buildings actually changed. They were completed, rebuilt, adapted for new functions. And then a standard explanation appears. After the Second World War, Nikolaikirche was restored according to old documents. The Cologne Cathedral was completed according to medieval plans. The Iberian Gate was recreated based on archival blueprints. A logical question arises. If in the 19th century they were able to store documentation so reliably, why do we not find detailed descriptions of construction technologies? Why are there no drawings of foundations, calculations of loads, diagrams of lifting mechanisms? There are beautiful facades, there are decorative elements, but the engineering documentation is missing. It is as if only what is needed to recreate the appearance has been preserved. Shells, decorations, but the essence, the internal structure, the true purpose, all of this is lost or hidden. There are beautiful facades, there are decorative elements, but the engineering documentation is absent. It is as if they have preserved only what is needed to recreate the appearance. Shells, decorations, but the essence, the internal structure, the true purpose, all of this is lost or hidden. Let's take a specific example. The Dmitrievsky Cathedral in Vladimir has supposedly burned many times. The last serious fire was in the 19th century. The cathedral was restored. However, the piece of fabric attributed to Dmitri of Thessalonica remained intact. A piece of cloth that is over 1,000 years old survives fire. The stone arches collapse, the roofing burns to the ground, but the piece of fabric remains unharmed. A miracle? Or did this artifact appear much later than the official version claims? Or maybe the fire itself was not as destructive as it is described. Or the building did not burn at all, but simply fell into disrepair, and it was restored, attributing the damage to natural disasters. History is full of such oddities. Miraculous rescues of relics amidst the complete destruction of buildings. Documents that survived the fires of archives. Plans that remained intact during the destruction of entire cities. Too many miracles. Too many coincidences. Too many discrepancies in the official version. 17 gates of Berlin have disappeared. 29 gates of Moscow have been wiped from the face of the earth. Hundreds of similar structures have been demolished across Europe. At different times, under different regimes, for various reasons. But the result is the same. The system is dismantled. The nodes are destroyed. Only samples for museums have been left. And the last question that remains unanswered. The Brandenburg Gate stood for 28 years behind a double border, not on the territory of East Berlin and not on the territory of West Berlin, in an isolated zone where no one was allowed. Why? What is the point of guarding the stone arch from people on both sides? If it is just an architectural monument, why couldn't at least the East Germans be allowed to approach it? And what if the gates represented something more? What if they retained residual functionality? What if it was still possible to pass through them, not just from one part of the city to another, but somewhere else? Then isolation makes sense. It is clear why the authorities of both Berlins agreed to keep this place closed. It is unacceptable to allow someone to accidentally activate what must remain turned off. In 1989, the wall was destroyed. The gates opened. People gained access to what had been closed for almost 30 years. But the system no longer worked. The gates became just stones. Beautiful, historical, but dead. The terminal is closed. The paths are severed. The connections are broken. Only the decorations of that system remain, which once linked cities and worlds together, and a mocking inscription on the stone, "Gates of the World," beneath images of the gods' war. Subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to click on the bell so you don't miss new investigations. There are many more mysteries and discoveries ahead. We will continue to search for evidence, ask uncomfortable questions, explore what official science avoids. Because the truth is always nearby. You just need to want to see it.